Remember when war was cold and we were all mad? Mutually assured destruction. On the one side, the Russians, on the other, the West, each side sure of its own position, and each side sure that given the amount of nuclear weapons, we'd be mad to mutually destroy each other. Now we're back to the future, but it's changed. Russia is acting strongly from a position of weakness, and the West no longer seems so confident about its own position. From its low point in the 1990s, Russia is back on the world stage, throwing cruise missiles and soft power all about. Never mind that it's almost been bankrupted by the drop in oil price, or that it can't even spell innovation. Russia seems to believe that the West isn't even bothering to bluff anymore. Because on this side of the divide, despite or perhaps because of events in the Middle East, war seems a little bit 20th century. And since the crash of 2008, there appears to be a crisis of confidence in liberal capitalist democracy. And the Americans are absent. They're not absent without leave. They're absent with leave from a Western intelligentsia which appears to be writing Yankee Go Home, but in more intellectual language. And now we're finally waking up and seeing the danger. We have the two worst US presidential candidates ever. When we were mad, there was a belief the USA would stand by NATO no matter what. That's been massively undermined by one of the candidates effectively saying, we will come to the aid of any NATO state which is attacked. Any. Except for those that we won't come to the aid of. And the other candidate is going to remain under FBI investigation for months to come. Whatever the president's name, the US election may deliver Vladimir Putin another trump card. Madness.
And thanks to our friends at the Restoration Furniture Shop in Stoke Newington in London for our fantastic locations this week. They're going to give the This Week studio a vintage makeover during the recess, which means they won't really have to change very much. Tim, welcome back to the programme. Let's begin broadly. What is Mr. Putin's game plan?
To stay one step ahead and to read us like a book, which he knows extremely well because of his past as an intelligence officer. And, for example, he gets that we have a crisis of confidence. He gets that people are thinking, hang on a minute, this democracy is delivering some freedoms, but what about the other bit? What about the capitalism? And the capitalism isn't working for enough people. And he's digging away, undermining through soft power. And then through hard power, he knows full well that we're obsessed with Brexit, understandably, that the European Union countries are trying to save the Union, and that the Americans are utterly obsessed, as they would be, with this amazing election. He's got a minimum of a 12-week window now to do whatever he wants before the inauguration of the next president. And in that window, he's probably going to smash Aleppo. And when we start saying, you're smashing Aleppo, every time we say Aleppo, he will say Mosul. And he'll have a point.
How much is he taking advantage of Western weakness, as you've outlined it, or the need to provide foreign diversions for a Russia that's in real trouble? I mean, Russia's in decline. It's not often repeated. The population's in decline. It'll fall 10% by 2050. The economy's in decline. The GDP's falling. Oil production is falling. I suppose, in a way, that makes it all the more dangerous.
Exactly. Russia is acting from a position of weakness, and that is why it is even more dangerous, perhaps, than it used to be. And yes, of course, Putin is re-establishing Russia on the world stage. I would argue has re-established it. And it plays extremely well back home. There is this deep longing within the Russian people that they are the biggest country in the world and they want their place in the sun. And he is getting them it at a great price. So
their GDP is no bigger than Italy's.
Oh, look,
even though it's the largest country. It's remarkable. No big. It's nowhere near as big as the United Kingdom's.
They have levels of poverty that are like in Bolivia. It's true.
But bread and circuses then work.
Exactly. And guns before butter. Because while we were spending the peace dividend on all sorts of things at the end of the Cold War. They were spending their peace dividend on weapons. They've subsequently tested those weapons, cruise missiles flying over towards Syria. They've now put their aircraft carrier right through the middle of the English Channel, sitting off the Med now, and they're going to use their brand new fighter jets in action. They've been rehearsing their, forgive me, toys, for want of a better word, and they are in a very strong position militarily, albeit underneath the whole thing, Russia is weaker than people think.
Michael, former defence secretary, what do you think the end game in the Middle East for Russia is? Perhaps a major naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Syria become, or what's left of Syria, that bit controlled by Mr. Assad, is the Russian sphere of influence.
Yes, and we've talked about the aircraft carrier sailing through the Channel and into the Mediterranean. So for a big Russian presence in the Mediterranean to become absolutely routine. And I have mentioned this before, it's an irony that an election is being fought by one candidate, Donald Trump, on the basis of Make America Great Again. But while this election is going on and Trump has nothing to say about it, the Russians are moving into the Mediterranean. It's a very big rearrangement of the cards. I think I just agreed with everything that was in Tim's film. And I am very worried about the weakness of Russia, because I think it does make them unpredictable. They obviously, Putin obviously wants to do things for glory. Trump has a point in saying that NATO countries really don't deserve protection if they don't pay their dues. But if Trump wins on Wednesday morning, I think Poland and the Baltic countries are going to feel very, very scared indeed. And by the way, if it were the case, and I think it most unlikely, that NATO countries then were forced to stump up the extra money, think about the consequences that there would be for the diversion of money from welfare, health and every other budget.
Well, how big a threat do you think there is to Eastern Europe and the Baltic states?
The people in those countries believe there is a very real threat. Polish people who are living here say this is their major concern. One of the things I think is important, though, I don't think it's just the vacuum created by the US during this election process. It's been building for a long time. Putin has seen the weakness of the West over Crimea and the Ukraine.
Also, Mr. Obama's not been engaged.
And also in Syria too. And this has been happening for a long while. And I think it is very interesting. You have Trump saying he wants to make America great again. Putin wants to make Russia great again. The clear thread throughout all his actions is to build Russia's sphere of influence in the world. And Trump is actually giving him his blessing.
Well, Donald Trump says NATO is obsolete. It's his word. And he admires Mr. Putin. I would suggest to you, Tim, that a Trump victory would probably be the biggest crisis in NATO's history.
Yes, because the effective commander-in-chief, because the American president is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces, and America is always really the driving force in NATO. I mean, he's already completely undermined Article 5 by saying he may not necessarily want to come to the aid of any country. Now, when Liz was saying about how worried they are, the one fact that makes you think, wow, for me, Lithuania has now got conscription again. That's how worried they are about what is happening. And if you do not stand together as NATO, he will pick people off one by one. So the Trump presidency, I think, would be interesting for NATO. He does not want Mrs. Clinton to get in, because Clinton's actually more hawkish than
Mr. Obama. Also, the relationship, they loathe each other.
Yes.
Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Putin. To come back to the point you made, though, Michael, I think there's no question that a Clinton presidency, it would be more engaged in Europe and the Middle East. But she would also face a huge build-up of Chinese naval power in the Pacific, expensive to counter. And I don't think any president could meet that threat and continue to stump up 70% of NATO spending.
Well, before we even get to that, I mean, whoever is the next president still has to face the problem, which is that all the political capital for any sort of intervention was spent in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Indeed.
Huge
that is the essential background to it. On top of that, it's difficult to persuade Americans why they should be involved in the Middle East when they're virtually self-sufficient in energy. But I agree that, although we've been insulted by the way that Obama has shifted the gaze towards China, it's clear that, China does represent a very important interest, challenge, maybe one day threat to the United States. And I think we shouldn't underestimate just how fed up they are. That, a number of very wealthy countries, you've just made the point that most of the NATO countries, a number of NATO countries individually are richer than Russia. So why on earth can't Europe manage its own defence?
The other interesting thing is that we're used to Russian hard power from the Soviet days, tanks going in, and then in the Putin days, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, Crimea. The new development, I would suggest, is that its soft power is now very formidable. They've been orchestrating leaks to come out in the US election. They've been helping to bankroll Marine Le Pen in France. They've got Russia Today, a Kremlin-financed propaganda channel. They've got the Sputnik news agency in Edinburgh. Their soft power is formidable now.
They have 40 diplomatic hubs across Africa. They're trying to get investment into Africa too, although the problem there, as you said, Tim, is that they have no innovation. It's very traditional sort of investment that they're looking at. So they're looking across the board here. And anything, I think, that they feel can undermine the West, whether that's through the leaks, the cyber hacking, or supporting opposition parties like the far right in France, they're using everything that they've got.
They're good at backing the forces of destabilisation.
They're brilliant. You talk about destabilisation. You mentioned Sputnik opening in Edinburgh.
In the People's Republic of Edinburgh.
They can read us like a book. They know what's going on in this country. They know that there are the divisions and the cracks. And that's why they've chosen to open an office in the capital of Scotland. They are brilliant at this, and they're doing it in all the European countries. They're doing it in Italy, they're doing it in France, they're doing it in Britain, and they're doing it very successfully. And it comes back to the crisis of confidence of how much do we believe in our systems. And if democracy, but crucially, if capitalism is not working for enough people, people start looking for other alternatives. Then you drift to the extremes. I would argue that they are an extreme. They are both extreme left and extreme right simultaneously, and they are attracting people from the extreme left and extreme right.
Right. Can't let all of you go or move on before I say who's going to be the next president by this time next week, or who's going to be the president-elect, I should say more accurately, by this time next week.
POTUS.
POTUS.
What is a POTUS?
No, I know what it is, the president of the United States, but who is it going to be?
Oh, I wish you hadn't asked me. The headwind is with Mr. Trump. The maths are still with Mrs. Clinton. Despite Brexit, which I thought would happen, but I wasn't too sure, I will go with the maths and Mrs. Clinton.
Liz. Well, it's interesting that you all have to think.
Yeah. I think it is. I think it's too close to call. I really do.
Really interesting.
Tim's analysis is right that the tide is running for Trump, and I think it's run for enough days since the FBI investigation that it will carry him to victory.
You do. There we go. Fascinating. Who would have thought we'd have been saying this a year ago? Tim, great to see you again as
Thanks,
always.
Andrew.
Thank you. Just to cheer you up.
Yeah, I think.